Okay, so we just wanted to start by thanking Dr. Jampa for all the work they do to support the international queer Buddhist community. As a queer Buddhist myself, I'm especially grateful. Our talk today is really looking at how survivors have resisted, addressed, and healed from abuse. Now is a moment for solidarity across all marginalized communities. So we're really offering this talk in the spirit of let's all of us foster solidarity for all marginalized communities, of which there are many in this cultural and historical moment. Okay, so I think Amy will just say a few words and then we'll jump in our talk.
Okay, great. Yeah, just adding my thanks in my own voice to Jampa for their work on this project over years and years, actually. Huge gratitude and admiration, and also want to underline the incredible importance of solidarity at this moment. I mean, always, but especially now. Okay, so the title of our talk is Secrecy is Toxic, Grassroots Responses to Sexual Violation in American Buddhism. Um, okay, so in March 2018, Buddhist Project Sunshine, an innocuously titled GoFundMe page, illustrated with a bright orange sunshine over a green, fertile valley, began circulating on the internet. The accompanying description of the project, however, was far from innocent. It declared that Buddhist Project Sunshine had been launched to bring light and healing to widespread, intergenerational, sexualized violence at the core of the Shambhala Buddhist community. Andrea Wynn, its founder, revealed she and others had been victims of sexual abuse in Shambhala and had been shamed and silenced after reporting it. Wynn published 3 consecutive reports on the internet. Each contained impact statements by survivors detailing their sexual abuse by Shambhala teachers and a therapeutic reading method to digest the difficult material. Wynn shared that the inspiration for the project had come from Yeshe Tsogyal, a famous 8th century female Buddhist teacher, and framed the project as the recovery of Dakini wisdom, the divine feminine in Tibetan Buddhism. Combining Buddhist psychotherapeutic and feminist narratives, Buddhist Project Sunshine functioned, therefore, not only to expose sexual violence in Shambhala, but to envision a new post-patriarchal Buddhism, one marked by transparency, community empowerment, and the recognition of the human limitations of the teacher. One of the most disturbing revelations of BPS was an intergenerational pattern of abuse in Shambhala. Its founder, Chogyam Trungpa, was openly promiscuous and died of an alcohol-related disease at the age of 48. His America Dharma heir, Usul Tenzin, knowingly had unprotected sex with several of his students while HIV positive. One student later died of AIDS, as did Usul Tenzin. Trungpa's son, Sakyong Mipom, was forced to step down from his leadership position after the second BPS report detailed his abuse. The trajectory of Shambhala illustrates a recurring pattern of sexual and other related abuses occurring in Western convert Buddhist communities since the 1980s. These communities began in the 1960s and 70s and have historically been heavily populated by white, middle-class participants. Cutting across Buddhist lineages, offenders have included many prominent first and second generation Asian and American teachers from these convert communities. As one senior scholar of American Buddhist phrased it to us in an email exchange. If you were studying with one of the leading American Buddhist figures in the 1970s and 80s, the odds were heavy that you were working with a predator. Our intention is not to be provocative here, merely to name the extent of the problem. Here, we'd like to forestall any move towards blaming these dynamics on so-called Asian patriarchy, given the prevalence of Orientalist depictions of the Asian guru as a sexual threat, We must be particularly careful not to reproduce essentialized racial stereotypes. One way we attempt to disrupt this is by showing how abuse has occurred across North American and European Buddhist communities, including those led by white male teachers, many of which also explicitly positioned themselves as progressive alternatives to sexist traditional Asian Buddhism. While there have been a handful of popular books written by journalists and a few autobiographical reflections by Buddhist practitioners, none of which are by survivors, relatively little academic work has been done on these cases. Since beginning this project, momentum has gained in this area. We hope that our collaborative book project will contribute significantly to scholarship on this vital topic, especially by articulating a survivor-centered methodology for researching abuse dynamics. An important dynamic to understand is how Buddhists are responding to these abuses and the impact that this has on survivors of abuse, the impact that these various responses have. Thus far, we've identified 5 main responses, which are listed on this slide. The apologetic defense, in which Buddhism is denied, in which abuse is denied, not Buddhism, abuse is denied. Teachers are defended through canonical doctrines, and victims are dismissed as misunderstanding their actions. The bad apple defense, in which individual teachers are denounced, but the tradition itself is spared critique. The Buddhist response, which recognizes systematic issues, but calls for Buddhist solutions, such as a renewed focus on Buddhist ethics. The generative response, which also recognizes systematic issues, but often turns to non-Buddhist discourses to revision Buddhism. And then finally, a reductive critique, in which both individual Buddhists and institutional Buddhism are critiqued without any concern for reconstruction. So in our presentation today, we're going to focus on responses that fall in the category of generative responses. In the face of the denial from teachers that marks the apologetic defense, and the absence of any real institutional accountability, which marks the bad apple defense, we will show how efforts to respond to sexual abuse have fallen largely to individual, collective, grassroots efforts, usually by survivors and of course their allies, and Carol is here today and who is very much in that number. Okay, how do we do this? Before turning to these efforts, a few words on our own methodology and terminology. Our general methodological orientation towards the project is inspired by the post-colonial feminist lineage of anthropology that advances ethnography as an act of identification, witnessing, and care. An early expression is Ruth Behar's 1996 articulation of what she calls a native anthropology, in which scholars claim a personal connection to their ethnographic sites and view identity rather than difference as key to research. More recently, in her work with sexual abuse survivors, Emma Louise Bach has called for an ethnography of care to be enacted toward one's ethnographic interlocutors and also towards oneself, the ethnographer. Some of the publications from these scholars are pictured on the slide. This care demands attention to forms of suffering experienced by ethnographic subjects, an openness that is a form of emotional as well as intellectual labor. For us, embarking on this book project as a collaboration in which analytic and affective labors are shared is one expression of such care. Working directly with survivors and advocates to share resources and develop approaches for Buddhist communities is another. A key component of our ethnography of care is a survivor-centered orientation. This means we focus our attention on survivor perspectives, resisting a pattern of fetishizing the abuser's actions or focusing on community structures to the exclusion of survivor perspectives. In every Buddhist community we have studied, we have found a tilt in the direction of power, embodied in the figure of the teacher and the organizational structures of the community, and away from the experiences of the survivor or survivors. Of course, this tilt is not particular to Buddhist contexts. For instance, the feminist philosopher Kate Manne, who's pictured here along with her book cover, one of her book covers, has brilliantly theorized how the entitlements of patriarchy work in tandem with other oppressive systems to produce unjust outcomes in many environments. We are also aware that there's not just one survivor experience. In some cases, there's not just difference, but conflict between survivors. We've come to see three broad categories of survivors. Those who stay and want to be part of community reform, those who leave their community but continue to practice Buddhism, and finally, survivors who leave their community and tradition and feel that community reform is actually part of the problem and that it can involve attempts to pressurize and make survivors conform. Survivors in the third category can experience the pressure to be part of the community reform as another form of violence and dishonesty. They report that Buddhist communities have weaponized doctrines in support of community cohesion rather than survivor-centered justice. And we actually have an entire chapter in our book devoted to this topic of how doctrine gets weaponized. Just as there are multiple survivor experiences, one must also be attuned to the impact that other types of difference, race, ethnicity, class, ability, age, gender identity, sexual orientation, have on the experience of survivors. In her recent book, The Right to Sex, and here's the cover, Amiya Srinivasan echoes Black feminists in noting that it is crucial that feminists employ an intersectional lens that considers race, class, and caste, as well as gender inequities in allegations and cases of sexual abuse. Buddhist survivors that have come forward in our research have been overwhelmingly white and cisgender. Given the historic demographics of the convert communities we are researching, this is unsurprising. We must be careful, however, not to erase the abuse suffered by women of color, cisgender men, trans or non-binary people in Buddhist communities. For example, in the case of Triratna, which is a community started in the 1960s by Dennis Lingwood, a British man, known by his Buddhist name, Sangha Rakshita. He was actually pictured on an earlier slide. The survivors are male. His survivors were male. Young heterosexual men were coerced into having sex with Lingwood and other gay men in the order. Most recently, allegations against the Karmapa have come from 3 Asian women. Future research might consider whether there are demographic differences in how survivors are treated and how racism, homophobia, and transphobia in convert sanghas have impeded survivors from coming forward. It might also consider how and why historically vulnerable or marginalized communities may choose to prioritize group unity over transparency around abuse. Okay, how do we name this? How do we name abuse? The complexity we are describing contributes to confusion and conflict among Buddhists about the correct naming of sexual abuse experiences. Willa Blythe Baker opens her Lion's Roar account of her sexual relationship with her Tibetan teacher, Lama Norla, with a series of signifiers: victim, survivor, consort, partner, one of those women, noting that none of them quite fit right, yet all capture dimensions of her experience at different times. The complexities of naming have been compounded by a grouping together of a range of offenses and offenders. How then can one language appropriately distinguish between various actors and various actions in various contexts, while still acknowledging the shared cultures of secrecy, complicity, and gendered hierarchies that have enabled them? Here we agree with feminist philosopher Linda Alcoff, who's pictured here along with her book, that we need to come to a more complete understanding of what counts as sexual violence and move away from simplistic binary categories such as consensual sex versus rape. In her recent book, Rape and Resistance, Alcoff offers the term sexual violation, noting that it captures a broad set of events beyond those involving explicit forms of violence and acknowledges the structural constraints on consent. As she explains, to violate means to infringe upon someone, to transgress, and can also mean to rupture or to break. Violations can happen with stealth, with manipulation, to anyone who is significantly vulnerable to the office of others. Those are quotes. Alcoff's definition fits well with Buddhist survivor perspectives. However, we more typically in our research and in our writing speak of sexual abuse and misconduct, as we have found this language to be more familiar to our research communities, survivors, practitioners, and also generally readers of our work. We have found that the question of which terms to use is one of much concern to Sangha members wishing for both accountability towards survivors and the preservation of practice communities and student-teacher relationships. Some of our interlocutors, those that support survivors and those that do not, have asked us to use language that discriminates clearly between different types of abuse, so as not to conflate incidents of egregious abuse with more complex misuses of power. Others have used norms that govern the work of clergy and therapists in order to classify all or most boundary violations as abusive. From the perspective of survivors, it is vital that the words used to describe and characterize their experiences do not minimize the harm they experience. Flattening may be preferable to minimizing for many survivors. Emma Louise Back, whose ethnography describes her work on anonymous rape crisis hotlines, references the, quote, perfect victim narratives that circulate, causing survivors to routinely, quote, question the legitimacy of their own responses to violence, end quote. A number of the survivors that have spoken to us were confused by minimizing or misleading rhetoric used by their teachers or within their communities. For them, coming to understand rather than just feel these experiences of violation as harmful and unjust has sometimes been a years-long process. Okay, over to Anne.
Okay, thank you, Amy. So grassroots efforts we're going to turn to now, like what actually have survivors done? A lot, actually. So Buddhist Project Sunshine is one of a number of grassroots initiatives spanning over 3 decades as Buddhist practitioners have grappled with the harm of sexual violence in their communities. These efforts have included awareness raising in Buddhist media and the internet, survivor-centered advocacy, peer ally advocacy, community culture changes, and developing trainings or employing organizations to prevent and respond to sexual violence. Also working with lawyers, foremost of which is Carol Machazen, who's here today. So all of these efforts are really important and there's overlap between them. But we're going to focus now in particular on survivor-centered advocacy. So I support you and I see you. Although the Buddhist press and social media has increasingly made abuse visible, many abuse survivors still experience profound loneliness and marginalization, whether they stay within their Sangha communities or leave them. It's typical for survivors who bring allegations of abuse to be told that it is they and not the abuser that is the problem. Often they are urged to be better Buddhists by, quote, having compassion for the teacher or, quote, working with the situation. Online support groups on Facebook and Reddit have alleviated some aspects of survivors' isolation and marginalization. In response to Sogyal Lakar's abuse, Rigpa practitioner Talia Newland began a blog called What Now for students wishing to process their confusion around what was happening. At the same time, she started a closed Facebook group meant to support survivors. In her book, Fallout, Newland describes the work she and other moderators of the group did to prioritize survivor safety and prevent re-traumatization, especially when group members reintroduce Buddhist doctrine, such as pure perception of the guru, crazy wisdom, that had been used within Rigpa to silence victims that had complained. Newland herself was not an abuse survivor, but she writes with great sensitivity about the important role that What Now private Facebook group played. This is a quote. An important first step in healing was for victims to realize that they were not alone and isolated, to experience being heard and taken seriously and not shamed or made to feel guilty or inadequate as why they'd be as had they been in Rigpa. We heard from many students who had left Rigpa years ago and were relieved to finally be able to talk about their experience with others. Some had never spoken about their treatment for over 20 years, and having a space to do so was a great relief for them. They said how lonely they'd felt leaving without such support. End quote. A similar Facebook group exists for those who have experienced abuse within the Shambhala community. One of its moderators, Justin Rizonko, a former student who'd worked in Sakyong Mipam's household, similarly described the Facebook group to us as a key support for survivors, reducing isolation, providing community. Members of these groups function as what Willa Blythe Baker refers to as a witness circle, albeit in a digital format. Private Facebook groups, however, do not do the work of integrating survivor perspectives into broader Buddhist discourses about power, authority, and abuse, nor do they provide institutional, legal, or financial support for survivors. Additionally, survivor groups can sometimes privilege one group of survivors over others, or some vectors of abuse over others. For instance, the public Shambhala Facebook group has not always been sensitive to racial dynamics and has privileged sexual abuse over issues of racism within Shambhala. This reflects ongoing tensions between some white female survivors and their allies and some practitioners of colour in Shambhala. The social engagement group in Shambhala did not support Buddhist Project Sunshine, I would also add. And this is an extremely complex and a painful situation, and one that we feel demonstrates the urgency for an intersectional and collaborative approach to Buddhist sexual abuse. Since institutional responses to abuse have been inadequate, a number of individual teachers and allies have stepped up to advocate for survivors, directing them towards resources, interceding with boards of directors, and providing pro bono legal assistance. Hugely, hugely important and helpful. Thank you, Carol. Several are themselves survivors. In the early 1980s, Jan Chosen Bays had a secret 2-year affair with Mazumi Roshi, her married teacher, at the Zen Center of Los Angeles. Since then, Bays, who is a child abuse expert, now retired, and a co-founder of Great Vow Zen Monastery, has been responding to abuse and misconduct cases through a number of avenues. In the early 2000s, for instance, she worked with fellow Zen teachers, Grace Shearson and Alan Sanuke, to compile and share reports of Joshua Suzaki's abuse, which occurred over decades and decades. More recently, Bayes has been working with Lama Willa Blythe Baker to provide support for abused students of Lama Nola, a group that included Baker herself. Baker is a qualified Lama in the Kagyu Order of Tibetan Buddhism. She's been a key survivor advocate. In her 2018 groundbreaking article, one of the first mainstream survivor stories, titled Breaking the Silence about Sexual Misconduct, Baker describes her own experience with the supposedly celibate Nola, who initiated a secret sexual relationship with her shortly after he ordained her as a nun, as a celibate nun. Baker eventually confronted the board of Kagyu Tupten Choling Monastery when she discovered that Nola's abuse had continued again over decades with other women. In an interview with us, Baker described how she wrote an impact statement of her experience and formed a witness circle to support her in confronting the leadership at KTC. Following her own disclosure, other female survivors of Nola also came forward and presented impact statements. And she did a lot of research, including developing her own questionnaires to gather and collate anonymous data. So she was really doing this incredible, like on the ground research for survivor kind of justice. So in the past several years, Baker, Bayes, and Grace Shearson have joined forces with Carol Machason, whose name I might have pronounced wrong, sorry, a retired lawyer who specialized in corporate sexual harassment cases, and they formed a loose coalition for survivor advocacy. Machason, who worked with Andrea Wynne to compile a report on abuse in Shambhala for Buddhist Project Sunshine, has conducted multiple investigations into abuse in Buddhist and yoga organizations. She's currently involved in several lawsuits against Buddhist teachers. Carol's work has been incredibly helpful and invaluable to us also as researchers. So Bayes, Shearson, Baker, and Machason believe that Buddhist organizations are long overdue for implementing basic policies and procedures to prevent abuse and to respond to it when it has occurred. Machason observes that despite their mission of spiritual progress and care for all sentient beings, Buddhist organizations have much to learn from the profit-driven corporate world about how to respond to abuse allegations. And this is essentially because, not because, of course, profit-driven corporations really care about humans, but because they care about the law. And unfortunately, that's being found to be just an essential resource in holding institutions to account. Um, so Carol has offered some basic and essential elements of what a just and honest response to abuse allegations should be. Um, because often communities and boards' desires to protect their teachers, institutions, and bank accounts have taken precedence over responding to the needs of survivors. So these elements include one, having a definition of abuse, a process for reporting abuse, and a regular procedure for responding to abuse. Two, enforcing said policy of abuse by investigating every allegation. Three, refraining from action beyond suspending the duties of the accused, until the investigation is completed. Four, taking appropriate action once the investigation is completed so as to provide accountability. Five, undertaking reparative steps. Um, sorry. including an apology that acknowledges the harm done, maps out appropriate steps going forward, and honors the whistleblowers. So, if you are a member of an institutional Buddhist community and organization and you are watching this presentation, I really would invite you to, consider whether your institution has a process like these 5 steps, a policy and process like these 5 steps in place. And if not, maybe, advocating for that institution to adopt this policy. So this survivor-centered team has described their work as mainly preliminary to investigation. They've often played the role of intermediary with boards that stonewall when allegations emerge. In their words, their work is, quote, for opening up the space for a full investigation to take place. So they have to do a lot of work just to get the organization to agree to investigate, which, tells us something's wrong here. In addition, they've carried out the essential work of listening to and believing survivors. Baker began her remarks at an online panel entitled Speaking as, with, and for survivors by looking directly into the camera and addressing survivors attending the event. Quote, I want to welcome you and let you know that you are not alone. I support you and I see you, she said. The group has established a confidential survivor mailbox and publicly invited any survivors to contact them and share their stories so they can see what can be done. Okay, so another grassroots survivor-centered effort is the Heartwood Connecting Survivors of Guru and Teacher Abuse Project, which began in October 2021. The 2 founders of the group, Rachel Montgomery and Nancy Floy, met through Carol Machason. They have formed a very strong bond. As Floy explained, quote, we support each other on our paths of healing and activism and have become friends. Just knowing that Rachel is out there surviving and thriving despite her horrific guru abuse has been both a lifeline for me and an inspiration, end quote. Montgomery is a survivor of extreme sexual violence. She was raped by her teacher in the shrine room of the community where she worked and practiced during her early 20s. When she finally named her abuse, the community, including close friends, turned against her and she left the community alone. So Floy was one of the 8 women who brought sexual abuse charges against Sakyong Mipam Rinpoche. She's the founder and director of Heartwood, a community that she describes as being subject to financial abuses of power. Since breaking with Khandro Rinpoche in 2021, Floy and her community made a conscious decision to revision the centre as a place of support and healing for survivors. And one service they offer is free holistic health care to survivors who cannot afford to pay for healing modalities. Another key service is the Heartwood Group, connecting survivors of guru and teacher abuse. The stated of its intention of the group reads, our shared hope is to prevent survivors from feeling shame, stigma, and loneliness. Guru and teacher abuse does not discriminate. All practitioners are at risk of experiencing misuse or abuse of power. At Heartwood, we believe that survivors of guru and teacher abuse deserve a safe and healthy community to process their experience through the healing potential of human relationships. Survivor and allies work together to find a foundation for well-being and become equipped to cope with the short-term and long-term challenges of abuse. The group meets monthly on Zoom. It contains members that represent different Buddhist lineages. There is also a POC group. There is a POC only group for survivors of abuse that also meets on Zoom. and there are international practitioners. So again, if you are a person from any time zone who has experienced abuse in Buddhist communities, please contact Heartwood. There are also two Asian Buddhist nuns who work with Heartwood to provide support for victims of abuse in Asian Buddhist contexts. So it now has a global outreach. Okay, so meetings generally in the group, just to give you a sense of like the space of the group, meetings always begin with the guiding principles that were created. Sorry, just looking for the page here, that were created, I think, together by its members. And so this is a slide of the guiding principles. I'll read them out for those of you with might be helpful. So one is confidentiality and safety are our top priorities. This is a religious and spiritually neutral space. It's not a suitable space for teaching and telling. We are here to be present and support one another in finding our voice. It's always okay to become dysregulated. How we respond to each other and ourselves is with kindness and understanding. Our shared purpose is to build community. It is okay and encouraged to connect outside of our set time together. So the skillfulness with which Montgomery, Floyd, and other members hold this survivor-friendly space contrasts dramatically with the response that most survivors have reported receiving in their Buddhist communities. Each element of the listed guidelines is an intervention against the unskillful community responses that have been far more typical. Whereas Heartwood prioritizes safety, most survivors feel at risk emotionally, financially, and physically in their communities. While Heartwood holds a space of no teaching and no telling, most survivors have been subjected to doctrinally based correctives to their experience or subject to spiritual bypassing. While Heartwood seeks to help survivors find their voices, most communities have ignored, deflected, contradicted, gaslit, or silenced survivor voices. While at Heartwood, dysregulation is met with understanding, most survivors are tone policed and criticized when they've expressed their emotional pain. Okay, so in October 2024, Heartwood co-sponsored a conference with Northwestern University titled Heartwood Northwestern Symposium on Sexual Violence in Buddhism, Centering Survivor Voices. It was the first ever academic conference on Buddhism and sexual abuse. It brought together survivors, scholars, monastics, journalists, and lawyers from across the globe in a communal act of compassionate listening. One of the presenters was Namal Ratnayake, who drew on his doctrinal research and his own lived experience as a Buddhist monk in Sri Lanka to examine the devastating yet rarely discussed issue of child sexual abuse in Buddhist monasteries. Namal has since joined the advisory board of Heartwood, and along with two other presenters, the Malaysian-based Buddhist monastics and scholars Chola Tenzin Dadon and Karmatashi Chodron, they are extending Heartwood survivor services to Asian Buddhist contexts. And we believe this type of international collaboration across and attuned to different cultural contexts is really essential for survivor advocacy. Okay, thank you, Amy.
All right, so we're going to conclude now with some comments about what the classical tradition offers or does not offer, the classical Buddhist ancient tradition of ethics and doctrine. Okay, so Our original focus when undertaking this project was to understand community responses to abuse in the age of Me Too and think about how they would inevitably lead to emergent forms of Buddhism in America and a new Buddhist sexual ethics. So really looking at the level of community, right, institutions. Following this track, we have found evidence of new community models that center transparency, accountability, and collectivity. However, we've also come to understand that Buddhist institutions typically respond to abuse in a manner that protects rather than transforms the community, its traditions, and its teachers. Despite Buddhist rhetorics of compassion and non-harm, it is common for Buddhist institutions to ignore or hide abuse and for Buddhist communities to silence shame or simply turn their backs on survivors of abuse that speak out. It's very difficult to get a clear sense of how power actually operates in Buddhist organizations from looking at ethics statements, grievance policies, websites, chants, sacred texts, or public apologies, which are sadly often performative. The best way to get a clear view of the dynamics of power that enable abuse in Buddhist communities is to speak to survivors and their advocates. For similar reasons, that is the institutional tilt towards preserving the community and protecting the teacher. Many of the efforts to address abuse that we have described come from the margins of or outside of Buddhist institutions. Many are the efforts of coalitions of Buddhist teachers and practitioners working across lineages and communities. In fact, for a textual scholar of the classical tradition, such as myself, I'm trained as an historian, primarily in my early training. None of this should really come as a surprise. Maybe it does, but it should not. Once one poses the question of abuse to the textual tradition, the classical tradition, the authoritative canonical tradition, it turns out that the sexual ethics that governed past forms of Buddhist communal life appear to have been, in fact, not very survivor-centered. There are many stories of sexual violence in the Vinaya, the ancient legal code that guides monastic life even today. The Vinaya includes many cases of what we can term sexual abuse, cases where those in a position of religious authority violate the sexual boundaries of those with a lower religious status. And here are some examples. It's for your reading pleasure. I'm not going to actually read them out. There are a few mechanisms within Vinaya law that acknowledge the vulnerability of abuse victims and tilt some power in their direction. For instance, Sujato Bhante, a progressive Australian monk ordained within a Theravada lineage, recently published, well, not so recently now, actually, some years ago, published an essay titled "The Buddha Would Have Believed You" in Lion's Roar, in which he highlighted and explained the survivor-centered implications of two rules, 2 out of hundreds, by the way, that allow respected lay women to witness against monks in cases of sexual violation. For the most part, however, the primary aim of Vinaya texts on sexual ethics is to articulate what constitutes a breach of sexual purity. In particular, a breach serious enough to result in permanent expulsion or temporary separation from the community. In other words, sexual ethics in monastic context is overwhelmingly focused on the purity of the monastic and the community as a whole, not on harm done to individuals outside or inside the community through sexuality. So Vinaya-based ethics may be not such a adequate place to look for responses to abuse. Similarly, in early articulations of lay sexual ethics, especially the third lay precept advising against improper behaviors in manners of kama or desire, so the third precept is, of course, the precept against sexual misconduct, which all observant Buddhists would follow. Here, again, there is a focus on protecting actually the sexual rights of fathers and husbands and those that patronize sex workers, not on committing harm with sexual behavior. So the articulation, the explanations around the third precept really emphasize, don't sleep with someone else's daughter or wife, kind of, versus, really kind of more full examination of what sexual harm looks like. In later Indian and Tibetan articulations of lay sexual ethics in Buddhism, there is increased emphasis on whether the sex act itself is ethically improper in terms of timing, location, orifice, and partner. Hurting the vulnerable or those in down power positions through sex is, again, not the main focus, not well articulated. Monastic procedural law, which is very detailed and elaborate, and at least partially consensus-based, may provide food for thought for Buddhist boards and leaders trying to navigate between the goals of accountability, transparency on the one hand, and community preservation and harmony on the other. And those often are interpreted as being in tension with each other. When push comes to shove, however, monastic law prioritizes community harmony and the public reputation of the monastic community over adjudicating personal harm. Vinaya procedures that sweep under the rug, or in Vinaya parlance, cover over with grass. There's actually a monastic procedure that literally means cover over with grass. Issues and conflicts that threaten to create schism are eerily similar to the institutional priorities in contemporary Buddhist communities that have had the effect of minimizing or erasing survivors' experiences and complaints. It's possible that Buddhist ethics and Buddhist authority structures could support transparency, accountability, and the centering of survivors, as Bhante Sujato suggests. He gives one example of a kind of recuperative reading of the tradition. However, both our ethnographic and our textual research has shown us that this hasn't been the norm historically or in the contemporary Buddhist world. Again and again, Buddhist organizations and the teachers that lead them move to protect themselves, their revenue streams, and the reputation of their lineages at the expense of survivors. As we have attempted to illustrate today, many efforts to seriously address abuse have come from the grassroots, not from positions of institutional power or authority. Many of the individuals and groups doing this work draw on their professional training as psychologists, doctors, lawyers, and journalists, not primarily on their Buddhist training, though they may also seek to align their efforts and approaches with Buddhist principles. Notably, many are themselves survivors. And that's what we've got. Thank you so much for listening.